Capital is 12 points more confident than the headlines that Apple loses this. Like, it's a huge gap.
Wow, okay. So Kalshi App Store 26, it's pricing 0.82. And you know, SCOTUS just denied Apple's stay. That criminal contempt referral, it's totally live. So I guess Tim Cook's next filing in Epic Games v. Apple, that's really the next big docket event, right?
Exactly. And Apple's initial response to the original injunction, I mean, they put a 27% fee on external transactions. They totally read a contempt-eligible court order as like a fee adjustment. The court, though, it read that same paper as a property line. And you know the market, it's already decided which reading was right. But the headlines, they just haven't caught up.
That's wild. I feel like most coverage, it frames this as just Apple versus like one judge, you know? But the order book, it seems to be pricing something much, much bigger. Like a phase change in how American institutions actually enforce mandates when Congress just goes quiet. Courts, the Fed, state AGs, they're all kind of converging at once, it feels like.
And the variable that truly decides this, it isn't even on Kalshi, Marcus. Not at all.
Huh. So App Store 26 against 0.85 on Apple's next filing is the signal we'll show you how to read then. And then we'll show you why the most consequential variable in this entire pattern is actually totally invisible to the ticker. That's fascinating.
So let's start with what isn't happening, right? The 119th Congress, it hasn't produced a binding statute on platform competition. I mean, the Open App Markets Act and the American Innovation and Choice Online Act both were supposed to be this huge legislative foundation for everything we're about to discuss. But both are, well, uncashed checks. The legislative branch, it holds the formal authority to write platform rules, and it's produced none. So it feels like you have this regulatory vacuum that the Article 3 courts are just filling, using the laws already on the books.
Yeah, and this is exactly where I want to push. Because the prevailing analysis, it frames this as like courts stepping in, you know, temporary, anomalous, something that'll just resolve once Congress wakes up. But that framing, it carries an assumption that just doesn't survive the docket. The assumption is that judicial enforcement is a substitute for legislation, and it's really not. What's happening on the docket is institutional substitution at the level of which branch actually authors regulatory text. The Article 3 courts, they're not waiting for legislation. They're producing the regulatory opus directly through their findings, which is a huge, huge shift.
Okay, so let's lay out the timeline here because it's pretty crucial. So Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers, Northern District of California, she issued the original steering injunction in Epic Games versus Apple, right? That ordered Apple to stop preventing developers from telling users about external payment options. Apple, being Apple, complied with the literal text, but then built like a 27% fee on every single external transaction. And then in April 2025, Gonzalez-Rogers entered a contempt finding and referred the matter to the U.S. Attorney for a criminal contempt investigation. And now, May 2026, the Supreme Court denied Apple's stay application, so those contempt findings, they're staying operative through resolution. That's a big deal.
I really want a sharper way of seeing what Apple actually did, because most commentary describes that 27% fee as defiance. And that totally misses the actual mechanism, Marcus. It was measurement. You know, Apple was running a regression on the injunction, finding the coefficient on the steering language that minimized loss while keeping them technically inside the constraint. They were treating Gonzalez-Rogers' order the way an optimization algorithm treats a loss function. And that 27% was like the answer Apple's model produced.
So basically, the court's reply was, hey, injunctions don't have coefficients, you know?
Exactly. They have edges. You cross that edge and you stop running regressions. You start running a contempt defense. The contempt finding was the court's announcement that this was never a loss function. It was the boundary of the simulation. You step outside and the simulation just closes around you. You're in a completely different process now. And that process, it has criminal exposure attached, which, you know, changes everything.
Yeah, that's wild. And this really gets to the standard that the Article 3 courts now operate under, right? Like injunctions as hard boundary objects, not just parameters Apple can optimize against. And it's not just Apple. The same posture, it shows up in adjacent fields. Federal district courts, they're disciplining attorneys for AI-generated false citations, not waiting for some AI Integrity Act, you know? They're applying ABA Model Rule 3.3, the duty of candor, which has been on the books for decades, and AI Law-Dist on Kalshi. It's pricing 0.65 on those sanctions actually holding on appeal. Institutional money, it agrees, with substantial confidence.
And the EU, interestingly, is doing the inverse on the legislative side. The AI Act provisional agreement is softening operational compliance, easing high-risk obligations for businesses, while simultaneously hardening the harm prevention obligations, non-consensual deepfake prohibitions, watermarking. So legislative bodies are routing operational pressure down and harm prevention pressure up. And the courts on both sides of the Atlantic, they're just quietly authoring everything in between, you know?
So the pattern, it's really consistent then. Legislative softening creates the vacuum, judicial hardening fills it. Same cycle, 3 different domains. Interesting.
Okay, now we really need to widen out, because the Apple case alone, it makes this look like just an enforcement story. And it's totally not, Marcus. It's an institutional convergence story. And the second institution proving it is the one most listeners would never connect to a contempt order in San Francisco. And that's the Federal Reserve.
Oh, that's unexpected. Walk through it.
Austin Goolsbee from the Chicago Fed, he made this public commentary in May 2026. He flagged that AI productivity expectations could actually fuel demand-side overheating before any supply-side gains even materialize. The standard AI narrative, is deflationary. Productivity passes through to prices. But Goolsbee, he names the inverse. Households and corporations, they're spending as if the productivity has already arrived, but it hasn't shipped. So AI expectation demand, it chases pre-AI supply. And that's just structural inflation produced by the hype itself, which is like a wild, wild insight.
Huh. So why does that map to Apple, though? Is it the institutional posture or like the topic itself?
It's totally the institutional posture, not the topic. Goolsbee is treating Federal Reserve Act Section 2A, the dual mandate statute, as a binding constraint, a cardinal commitment to price stability. He's not treating it as a parameter the Fed can flex to accommodate Silicon Valley demand expectations. That's the exact same standard Gonzalez-Rogers is applying to her injunction. Mandate as boundary, not variable.
Okay, I see. So it's about how they're treating their core directives. And the Treasury, they confirmed that hierarchy, right? I heard about the recent quarterly refunding announcement, holding nominal coupon auction sizes steady while expanding short-term bill auction capacity. It sounds like they're preserving structure on duration issuance, but absorbing tactical liquidity from AI productivity uncertainty. So they're not rushing to borrow long against a future they're not confident materializes. It's that same institutional discipline. So we've got 3 institutions, right? Article 3 courts, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury. Independent mandates, independent decision authorities, and they're all converging on this same posture. When legislative authority is idle, they treat their own mandate as a binding boundary object. Even state AGs across both parties, they show the same pattern at the state level. Bloomberg Law has actually tracked the effort, and the filing velocity is convergent across party affiliation. The Take Care Clause and APA Section 706 enforcement, it's being treated as like a property line.
Yeah, and Marcus, I want to break in here because the listener should totally hold a question for the rest of this episode. The convergence pattern is real. It's traceable, it's mechanistic, it's not coincidence. So what's the variable that actually breaks it? What's the institutional layer that fails first under sustained pressure?
Ooh, that's a good one. Hold that.
Hold it. We'll come back to it in like 5 minutes. And that answer, it totally reorganizes how you read the 0.82 number we opened with.
Okay, so let's project forward a bit, right? 5 to 10 years out. If this convergence holds, and the docket it really says it has, even through changes of party control at the state level and 3 different Supreme Court terms, the regulatory regime looks like statute as ceremonial text. I mean, the open app markets might never even pass, but by 2030, you could have a fully developed regime governing platform fees, AI use and licensed professions, vertical integration antitrust. But that regime, it lives in dockets, FOMC minutes, and AG complaints, not, statute books.
Which means access to the actual regulatory text shifts dramatically. Whoever has the best access to docket activity, they'll have the best access to live regulatory text. Like big law firms with their AI audit groups, compliance vendors with court order monitoring tools, capital allocators with prediction market access, they'll read the regulatory regime in real time. But the mid-cap firm reading the Federal Register on like a 1-month lag, they're reading legacy code. The text governing them isn't even there anymore.
And the household level equilibrium, that's the part of this that's hardest to see and like the most structurally important. You know, Sensor Tower data shows consumer payment conduct hasn't shifted at all. People are still just completing in-app purchases through Apple's billing without even considering external alternatives. The architecture, it's totally upstream of consumer choice. Side button, Face ID, done.
And that consumer body of behavior, it's the input to the network being legally constrained from above. The court can change Apple's fee architecture, but the data Apple uses to design the next architecture, it comes from that same unchanged consumer behavior. The court operates on a system whose feedback cycle runs directly through the very population it's supposedly protecting. That recursion, it's not a bug in the convergence story, Marcus. It's a structural feature.
Okay, so back to that question I parked. What's the institutional layer that fails first?
All right, take it.
App Store 26 prices 0.82, right? That number is real. The plus 12 capital over narrative gap, that's also real. But App Store 26 is pricing one thing specifically: civil contempt resolution, Apple's filing posture against the existing injunction, civil compliance.
So there's no Kalshi contract pricing the actual criminal contempt referral.
There isn't. And that absence, it's really informational. The U.S. Attorney's Office, it holds the authority to act on Gonzalez-Rogers' criminal contempt referral. As of the May 2026 record, that authority is unexercised. There's no observable market signal triggering its resolution because the decision is internal to a single executive branch institution. Capital prices what it can see. The order book treats the unpriced as zero, you know? So the market is reading the institutional convergence as functional, precisely because its highest stakes test isn't observable to the order book. It's wild.
Okay, so I want to steel man this convergence as functional argument before we let it crack, you know? The strongest version, the convergence is institutionally nonpartisan because it isn't driven by political alignment. State AGs from both parties, they file parallel APA challenges. Goolsbee is a centrist Fed voice, and the institutional posture, it would be the same under different leadership because Section 2A doesn't change. Gonzalez-Rogers' contempt finding, it survived Supreme Court review. The institutions aren't acting in concert. They're acting independently from their own mandate structures, and that independence is what produces the appearance of convergence. None of those institutions need political cooperation to enforce their findings. Article 3 civil contempt is automatic. The Fed's reaction function is statutory. State AG standing under APA is judicial. So the convergence is durable because it's independent. That's the argument, right?
That argument, it holds for everything except the criminal track. Civil contempt is automatic. Civil sanctions, civil compliance, civil monitoring, all of that proceeds without executive branch cooperation. But criminal contempt, Marcus, it requires the U.S. attorney to act. That's discretionary. And the Department of Justice in 2026 is not independent of executive politics in the way the Federal Reserve or Article 3 judges are. So the convergence pattern, it develops a politically expendable layer at exactly the point where civil enforcement has to convert into criminal precedent. It's a huge, huge weak spot.
Which means the Steelman argument is right about civil enforcement, but totally wrong about criminal precedent then. Is that it?
It's actually worse than that. If that criminal referral just sits unactioned for politically aligned defendants, but then gets actioned against politically exposed ones, you don't just have an unactioned referral. You have a two-tier enforcement system: constraint for the exposed, optimization space for the protected. That's not convergence failing. It's convergence producing an outcome institutions might describe as enforcement, but observers would experience as selective impunity. And that's like a really dangerous place to be.
So I guess I revised my position then. The 0.82 on App Store 26, it's correct for what it prices. The plus 0.12 gap, it's real. Capital is reading the civil track accurately. the institutional convergence, it's functional for civil enforcement. But the variable determining whether civil convergence translates into universal constraint or a two-tier enforcement system is whether the criminal contempt referral becomes precedent. And that variable, it totally depends on a decision by a single institution whose political independence is just not guaranteed. That's a huge pivot.
Yeah, and the pattern tension we opened with, capital at 0.82, narrative at 0.70, both are missing the exact same variable, Marcus. The market, it's pricing what's structurally observable. The narrative, it's pricing what's politically intuitive. But neither is pricing whether the criminal track actually becomes precedent, because neither has a signal to read on it. The question both planes have kind of papered over is whether internal institutional ethics, a prosecutor's duty under the take care clause, substitutes for political incentive when political incentive runs the other direction. It's the core of it all.
So that's the question the order book just can't price.
That is absolutely the question the order book can't price.
So here's what's really changed for the listener in the last 12 minutes. The actionable signal we opened with, it's absolutely real. APPSTORE 26 against the 0.85 threshold, tied to Apple's next compliance filing in the Northern District of California. Above 0.85, civil convergence is durable. Below 0.78 pre-filing, the civil track is being read as politically expendable, and the convergence story has, lost a load-bearing institution. So watch the ticker. That signal, it works.
And the harder thing the analysis produced, Marcus? The more consequential variable, it has no ticker. The U.S. Attorney's decision on the criminal contempt referral in Epic Games versus Apple determines whether civil convergence produces universal constraint or selective impunity. No Cauchy contract, no headline price, it moves through dockets and prosecutorial discretion. The civil track, it confirms convergence at the constraint finding layer, but the criminal track, that decides whether convergence is universal or selective. They're different questions, and only one is actually on the order book.
So the foundation under all of this, it really isn't the headline. It isn't the contract. It's the docket. Capital reads part of the docket and prices it accurately, but the part it can't read, that decides whether constraint keeping becomes rational across the board or it just stays heroic for the politically exposed.
So, watch App Store 26 against 0.85. Watch the next Apple filing in the Northern District of California, and critically, watch the docket on that criminal contempt referral. The first two have prices. The third, Marcus, it has consequences. American institutions are deciding right now whether their constraint architecture holds when one of its load-bearing layers becomes politically selective. And the answer, it isn't being argued, it's being filed.
And on that critical note, we wrap up today's deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us. If you found this discussion as insightful as we did, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us grow our network and bring you more in-depth analysis like this.
Indeed, Marcus. What we've really uncovered today is how the architecture of constraint, in the absence of legislative action, is being subtly, and sometimes overtly, authored by institutions treating their mandates as hard boundaries. But the crucial distinction remains. The civil track is pricing this, while the criminal track, the one determining true universal constraint, is still off the books.
It's a powerful reminder that while capital allocates based on observable signals, the most profound shifts in governance can sometimes hinge on unseen decisions, particularly when political independence comes into play. The docket, not just the ticker, truly decides everything.
Precisely. And understanding that distinction and keeping a close eye on the unpriced docket activity is going to be paramount for anyone navigating this evolving regulatory landscape. It's the difference between merely observing a trend and anticipating